Hello, I apologize for taking so long to have a new video, an actual video for you guys instead of some caretaker-inspired ambient noise. Truth be told, I don't know if what I'm feeling is necessarily burnout or if I'm just procrastinating or just not having any time to do this. Really, I think it might be a mix of the three. I keep getting scheduled for 6-7 day weeks in my main job, my wage slave labor, which makes it hard to have any energy left over for content creation. I think I may also be experiencing an anxiety attack, which may be causing me to withdraw a little bit, but I finally decided to sit down and attempt to make a video. I was going to make a video reading stories from people that lived through poverty, but I didn't really find so much stories as finding things that they had to do without much context or backstory. I wanted to make that video because in the final week of last month, my family back in Kansas were suffering bad. They ran out of food and had zero money to go and buy food until the first of the month. Having saved up $5,000 now, I felt bad having all this money while they were literally starving. Since I can't really find stories to read from people that have been through or are currently going through poverty, I thought I'd bust some myths and lies about socialism. After all, I guess if you're going through poverty, you can't have a computer, you can't have a phone, at least that's what people say, conveniently forgetting that stealing is something that people do and poverty is one of the main causes for it. Today, instead, I'll be taking a look at 3 lies, particularly about the Soviet Union and what the truth is. As always, I'll try to leave links to my sources in the description. The first lie I want to look at is that the Soviet people were impoverished. What time period are we even talking about here? In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was plagued with a famine that, despite being known by Ukrainian nationalists as the Holodomor, affected Kazakhstan and Siberia to a greater degree. Is that the time period we're talking about? Or are we talking about the Russian Civil War, during which there was a shortage of bread and the country was pretty much just one giant military camp? The Soviet Union's baptism by fire is a rather unfair jab, seeing as how badly the odds were stacked against the Red Army. The liberals, Tsarists, separatist nations, Central Powers, allies, and revisionist leftists all fought against the Bolsheviks. So it's no surprise if people that were under Bolshevik administration were not doing very well for the first few years of the war, living their lives in the crossfires. If we're talking about the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet government was spending more on military and supposedly taking everything their people made, then fine, let's clear some things up. Let's start by first addressing the fact that the Khrushchev and Brezhnev administrations were revisionist. Despite the seeds of neoliberalism being sown with Khrushchev and his campaign of de-Stalinization, the average caloric intake of the Soviet population remained higher than that of the US between 1960 and 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power and drove the country into neoliberalism and collapse. It also appears that this was the case even before 1960. The last famine the Soviet Union faced was in 1947, which saw 900,000 deaths, affecting Belarus most severely, with 500,000 people dying in Belarus as a result. The famine was mainly caused by infrastructure damage from World War II and a drought in 1946. The Soviet government did what it could to soften the blow the famine dealt its civilians, including rationing food, something that the United States has no concept of, or the more likely case that they just don't give a fuck if rural working class families go broke and starve to death. While people like this can eat as much as they damn well want, just because they have a lot of green-colored paper with faces and numbers and cultural symbols on it, or a big number in their bank account. The second lie I want to look at is Joseph Stalin being a Russian nationalist and anti-Semitic. I'll be pulling from the communism subreddit a post titled "Stalin was a Russian nationalist and hated Jews" myth. Our comrade, who identifies himself as Odarin, cites Article 123 of the Stalin Constitution enacted in 1936. It reads, "Equality of rights of citizens of the USSR, irrespective of their nationality or race, in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life, is an indefeasible law. Any direct or indirect restriction of rights of, or conversely, any establishment of direct or indirect privileges for citizens on account of their race or nationality, as well as any advocacy of racial or national exclusiveness or hatred and contempt, is punishable by law." Also worth noting is that the Stalin Constitution established the Soviet of Nationalities with Article 35, which states, "The Soviet of Nationalities is elected by the citizens of the USSR according to union and autonomous republics, autonomous regions, and national areas on the basis of 25 deputies from each union republic, 11 deputies from each autonomous republic, and 5 deputies from each autonomous region, and 1 deputy from each national area." This was enacted in December 1936 when the Stalin government was nearing its 13th year in power. In January 1931, about 7 years after Stalin succeeded Vladimir Lenin, the Jewish news agency sent to Stalin regarding anti-Semitism, to which he replied, "Anti-Semitism is of advantage to the exploiters as a lightning conductor that deflects the blows aimed by the working people at capitalism. Anti-Semitism is dangerous for the working people as being a false path that leads them off the right road and lands them in the jungle. Hence, communists, as consistent internationalists, cannot but be irreconcilable, sworn enemies of anti-Semitism. In the USSR, anti-Semitism is punishable with the utmost severity of the law as a phenomenon deeply hostile to the Soviet system. Under USSR law, active anti-Semites are liable to the death penalty. Though I personally believe in re-education and rehabilitation as a first response in dealing with non-violent anti-Semites, make of that what you will, this truly serves as a testament to Stalin's opposition to anti-Semitism and racial prejudice as a whole. Not to mention that he led the country through a defensive war against the anti-Semitic Third German Reich, which systematically and deliberately killed 6 million innocent Jewish people. The Soviet military, under the authority of Stalin, counter-invaded and chased the Wehrmacht back to their dawn, capturing Berlin in the process. Then there's the question of the Gulags, which this will serve as an omen to the next lie I'll be debunking. Many people like to compare the Soviet Union's Gulags to the German Reich's concentration camps, when in fact those two systems are very different in how they operated, and I'll get into why soon. But one argument that is used to uphold the lie of Stalin's Russian nationalism is that non-Russians were heavily affected. In 1939, 1.28 million people were in the Gulags. During that time, the Soviet population was 170 million, meaning that 0.75% of the Soviet population was in the Gulags. Compare this to 2 million in the US prison system currently, which mostly imprisons racial minorities, with black people, being people of African descent, taking up the largest portion of the pie. The largest race group in the Gulags in 1939 was the Russians at 810,000 prisoners, followed by Ukrainians at 182,000, and Belarusians at 43,000. And let's not forget a simple fact about Stalin himself. The guy was a Georgian, not an ethnic Russian. If he were a Russian nationalist, his own views would end up conflicting with his own rights, and possibly his own existence at some point as well. The final lie I'll be looking at today is of course going to be the conditions of the Gulags. Rightists claim that the Gulags were barely different from the concentration camps that dotted the map of the Third Reich. Long sentences, hard labor, torture, starvation, and executions carried out in the Gulags for even the most minor crimes. One of the automated replies on the deprogrammed subreddit, when the Gulags are brought up, is what I'll be mainly focusing on in this section. The first part reads, according to anti-communists and Russophobes, the Gulag was a brutal network of camps established in the Soviet Union under Stalin's ruthless regime. They claim the Gulag system was primarily used to imprison and exploit political dissidents, suspected enemies of the state, and other people deemed undesirable by the Soviet government. They claim that prisoners were sent to the Gulag without trial or due process, and that they were subject to harsh living conditions, forced labor, and starvation, among other things. According to them, the Gulags were emblematic of Stalinist repression and totalitarianism. The person responsible for the fear-mongering over the Gulags would be Robert Conquest, a former IRD employee. His book, The Great Terror, released in 1968, formed the mass execution lies, and much of the evidence used in this writing turned out to be defector testimonies. It should be noted that the IRD was a secret anti-communist propaganda department operated in Britain during the Cold War, which spread disinformation to smear socialism and communism, as well as socialist political entities, anti-colonial movements, and socialist and communist individuals. In 1973, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, fascist sympathizer and former Red Army commander, wrote The Gulag Archipelago, following his release by the Khrushchev administration. In his book, he repeats the Red Army mass rape myth from the standpoint of we, the Red Army, were no better than the fascist German army. There is a whole piece on Solzhenitsyn on the deprogrammed subreddit. I'll also link to the video I did a while back debunking the Red Army mass rape myth. Solzhenitsyn formed the forced labor and show trials myth, among others. Encountering many of the lies about the Gulags, we can take from a CIA document titled Forced Labor Camps in the USSR, Transfer of Prisoners Between Camps. Point 26 states that until 1952, prisoners were given guaranteed rations with extra food as a reward for over-fulfillment of quotas. Point 28 states that starting in 1952, this was replaced with economic accountability, meaning that the more the Gulag prisoners worked, the more they were paid, something that does not happen with ordinary wage slaves in the United States. Instead, we're mostly paid on an hourly basis, with salaried workers getting paid a specific amount regardless of how much work they do or how many hours they work. Point 28 also states that as a result of recovering from the war, rations were increased. Point 40 states that every day that the prisoners overfulfilled the norms by 105%, that day of the sentence was counted as 2 days, shortening their sentence. Also an incentive we do not have in the United States. Even for ordinary wage slaves, we do not get 2 days worth of pay for performing 2 days worth of labor. Point 13 states that until 1954, prisoners worked 10 hours a day before their workdays were shortened to to 8 hours a day like free workers. Point 52 states that 95% of prisoners were actual criminals. Point 10 states that in 1953, amnesty was granted for 70% of criminals in a sample camp studied by the CIA. Most, though it's not specified exactly how many, would find themselves returned to the gulags for newly committed crimes. Seeing as how the supposed horror of the gulags is one of the go-to arguments for liberals in the imperial core, I encourage anyone that sees this to dive deep into the matter. Comrades, arm up for debates with right-wing friends and family. Liberals, please, today stop letting politicians think for you. Look for the sources. I've left plenty in the description. Even CIA documents cannot attest that the gulags were death camps on par in brutality with Auschwitz-Birkenau. Please also look at the additional resources, links to which will also be provided in the description. Video essays, books, articles, all right there at your fingertips. All it costs is an open mind and a willingness to change your perspective when presented with new evidence. And with that, I think I've found a stopping point for this video. If you enjoyed hearing my voice again and agreed with what I had to say, please be sure to click thumbs up on this video, share it with friends and family. It matters not whether or not they are socialist or sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. Everyone deserves to know the truth, which capitalist politicians and liberal propagandists have tried to bury for so long. Please also leave some comments. If you have any sources to strengthen the arguments I made in this video, please drop them, the more the merrier. Any lies that you know of about the Soviet Union or any socialist or communist entity, individual, or about the ideology itself, debunked with sources, that is also welcome. Discourse is also appreciated. Please be sure to subscribe for more content like this, as there will be more, and be sure to click the bell to get notified when I upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back soon enough with another video. Bye guys.